Let's talk to Dr. Laura Smith, presidential historian at Richmond, the American International University in London. Dr. Laura, very good afternoon to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
Not at all. Now, we occasionally go into areas where perhaps other people don't go. Today, we're going to look at Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was the longest-serving president of the United States ever. Apparently, he had 4 terms, which is sort of unheard of, isn't it?
Absolutely. He was unprecedented in terms of running for a 3rd term, well, actually being elected for a 3rd term. And it was really World War II that made that possible.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, you carry on.
Yeah, so he died during his 4th term. He died just after Yalta in 1945. But he really set the stage for global politics as we know it today, America as a superpower, and also domestic politics and the role of the presidency and the federal government in our lives.
Yes, because he's famous for the New Deal, which I guess we'll get onto in a little while. But, I mean, it's hard to imagine, I suppose, having an election in the middle of a war. But I guess in 1940, America wasn't quite in the war, really. And by 1944, I suppose they were considering it to be near the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I mean, in terms of elections during war, 1864 and Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War takes the cake for that.
Right.
But for FDR, he had a lot of foresight in thinking that America would almost inevitably become entangled and involved in World War II. And he had a lot of work to push against these isolationists that are so often forgotten when you think about American society today. But America First had a long history, especially in the interwar years.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's a phrase you hear a lot now, America First. But in fact, you don't really think of going back quite as far as that to find it. I mean, Britain was similar, wasn't it? There were quite a few people in this country who were not keen on getting involved in a fight against Hitler.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Isolationism is not just renowned in the States. It has a long global history. And obviously, these things are interconnected. And we know FDR and Churchill, we think of the special relationship. And it's just those sort of cultural similarities and political ideologies that share transatlantic partnership.
And did he have the same vice president throughout the 4 terms, or did that sort of chop and change?
It did chop and change. So Truman, when he took over after FDR's death, he didn't know about the atomic weapons. He didn't know about that capability had been built. And so he had to make that decision, catching up on the top secret intelligence at the time.
Right, interesting. Tell us about the New Deal, because that kind of set the stage, really, did it not, for America's recovery from the war? Not just the recovery from the war, but the whole kind of building of the infrastructure of the country.
Yeah, it's still a matter of debate, really, just how much the New Deal helped in terms of economic recovery from the Great Depression, because a lot of scholars would argue that it was really World War II that had the greatest impact in recovery for the economy. It was that industrial buildup, the arms buildup, etc. But it was certainly a very different approach from Hoover, who got kicked out of office by FDR in 1932. And FDR had this optimism that really resonated with people. He got elected on this campaign of happy days are here again. And it's sort of quite Reagan-esque, really, this great communication, this idea of coming into office, even though, there's an economic anxiety, great economic pain being felt. And he uses this 100 days, this momentum, to get a lot of bills passed, including things that are relied on today. So it's going back to this idea of the role of federal government in Americans' lives, having that safety net, Social Security. But he didn't get everything he wanted passed. And that's really important to remember as well. Things like healthcare, it's still an issue in American politics. It is still a very difficult, controversial thing, this concept of universal healthcare, but it was something that he would have liked to have gotten past.
Yes, and you mentioned he's a bit sort of Reagan-esque. Is that the president that you would maybe so closely associate him with, if you were to convince people that this was the kind of president he was? Was he like Reagan?
Certainly not in ideology, but in terms of communication, absolutely. If you think of presidents who are renowned as, obviously we think of Reagan, the great communicator. We also think of Kennedy. We also think of Barack Obama. Yeah. These are presidents who really have that gift and are able to use political rhetoric to a great advantage.
Okay. And there was an interesting sort of development, was there not? Because he had a disability which nobody really knew about.
Absolutely. So what's really interesting, if anyone has seen The Post, the film The Post with Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep, it really talks about this idea of the press being the president's friend.
Yeah.
And this changed during the Vietnam and definitely with Watergate. That was the real shift between the relationship between the president and the press. But during FDR's time, the press, obviously being around him, they knew that he was wheelchair bound. And there were photographs of him being helped or lifted out of a car. But for purposes of morale, they decided not to share this with the American public. And we think today about candidates having to share all of their details, medical history, traditionally speaking anyway, and taxes and things like that. So this was a very different relationship. And he had been crippled by polio at the age of 39. And he actually designed the wheelchair that he used himself. And he had a car that he could operate by his hands. And so it was all meant to make it look like he was a fully able-bodied man, not to have anyone question him, or it hurt America's sort of image, if you like, if he looked enfeebled in any way.
Right. It's interesting, isn't it? I read a great book once, I can't remember the name of it, by William Safire, who was once a speechwriter for Nixon. And he wrote this novel about a president who went blind while he was in office, and all the measures that they took to try and prevent that from becoming known in public, because he was thought that if they shared the fact that he was blind, he would suddenly lose all of his authority. And it's interesting that even, I suppose, now you see presidential debates around people's health, and remember Hillary Clinton was accused of not being very well by Trump, and it's I don't think there's any other country where that becomes such a big deal.
You certainly could make that argument. I mean, Wilson as well, he wasn't very well. He had a stroke. He was really sort of incapacitated, and it was the First Lady who took on quite a bit of the administration side. Right. So yeah, there's certainly there, and of course JFK, his back injury is another really good example. But it's something that in today's society with social media, I don't think you could really get away with.
No, I think that's probably right. And was it after FDR's time in his fourth term that they limited it now to 2 terms only?
Yes, that's exactly right. So that's when the amendment was passed, that it had to be 2 terms, and that was based on tradition and the precedent originally set by George Washington. Right. A lot of people, if they're talking about Washington's greatness, they will sort of hang that argument on the fact that he knew when to leave. And sort of, the graceful gentleman knows when to leave. Right.
Yes, I think that could be levelled at 1 or 2 people in the modern age, could it not? Great to talk to you, Dr. Laura Smith. Thank you very much indeed. Presidential historian at Richmond, the American International University in London. FDR, an amazing character, a tremendous president, and an amazing historical figure for the United States of America in terms of what he did and how long he did it for. 4 terms at 16 years in the White House, also creating what is now known as the New Deal, of course.